a journey through three great worlds: the icy fjords of the Vikings, where the scent of salt and resin hid an unimaginable sophistication for the barbarians; the silken chambers of the Forbidden City, where the shadows of eunuchs were longer than the emperor's own; and the towering peaks of the Andes, where gold had no value and knots on ropes told the stories of entire dynasties. I'll reveal to you 30 great misconceptions, 30 historical mirages that generations believed in. And when the dust settles, you'll see that the truth is not just stranger than fiction, it is its creator. This journey will change everything you thought you knew, so stick with me till the end to witness the collapse of the titans of history. Myth number 1. The silent army that shouted in color, ancient China. Picture this. You're standing at the edge of an excavation site, and before you lies eternity frozen in clay. 8,000 warriors in perfect formation, each with their own face, frozen in a silent march to the afterlife. This is the Terracotta Army, the greatest testament to the ego of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. For decades, since their stunning discovery in 2017, the world has been in awe of this sight. We were taught to see them as a symbol of harsh, monolithic power. Gray, earthy figures, lacking individuality apart from their facial features, ideal soldiers of a soulless imperial machine, ready to serve their master even after death. This image, of gray, silent strength, seeped into documentaries, books, and our collective consciousness. It became a metaphor for totalitarian power. Identical, faceless units merged into an unbreakable mass. We believed in this gray silence because it perfectly matched our view of the cruel emperor who burned books and buried scholars alive. The army was supposed to reflect his will, cold, unified, and frightening in its uniformity. But that was just a shadow of the truth, an illusion created by 2 millennia spent underground. The reality that archaeologists uncovered, peeling away a thin layer of time, turned out to be dazzling, almost screaming. When the first fragments of clay warriors were brought to light, scholars noticed something strange: microscopic particles of paint. The deeper they dug, the clearer the picture became, flipping everything upside down. This army wasn't gray. It was a riot of color. Each warrior was hand-painted with incredible detail. Their armor was lacquered and painted in dark brown and black, with bright red, blue, and green laces holding the plates together. Their undergarments weren't just clay-colored, they were purple, pink, and azure, colors that were worth a fortune back then. Faces were painted in flesh tones, with black eyebrows and mustaches. Some even had red pupils drawn in to give them a vibrant, fierce look. Imagine not 8,000 gray statues, but 8,000 unique, brightly dressed soldiers, shining in the sun as if they had just stepped out of the emperor's barracks. This wasn't an army of ghosts. It was a living, breathing panorama of the military might of the Qin dynasty. The truth was much more complex and impressive. The emperor wanted to take with him not just an army, but life itself in all its splendor. Studies revealed that rare minerals from distant provinces were used to create the colors. Purple, for instance, was a synthetic pigment known as Han purple, whose creation involved incredibly advanced chemical processes, thousands of years ahead of its time. This shows that the Qin Empire was not just a killing machine, but also a center of incredible technological innovations. The myth of the Grey Army was convenient, making history simple. But the truth is, time is the greatest thief. It stole the colors from the warriors, leaving us with only their pale shadows. And now, as we look at them, we must stretch our imagination to see not silent figures, but the dazzling glory of an empire frozen on the edge of eternity. From this underground splendor, hidden from view, we leap to the windswept shores of Scandinavia, where another myth linked to purity turns out to be the exact opposite of what we think we know. Myth number 2. Disheveled savages reeking of barbarism. Vikings. Close your eyes and picture a Viking. What do you see? Probably a mighty man with a tangled beard, still holding remnants of yesterday's dinner. His hair is messy. His clothing made of coarse hides is dirty and stained with blood from another raid. He gives off a smell of sweat and campfire smoke. This image of a wild, unkempt barbarian has become so ingrained in our culture that it's almost a given. For centuries, Christian chroniclers describing the raids of the Northmen painted them as creatures from hell, dirty, cruel, and lacking any notion of civilization. Anglo-Saxon monks, whose monasteries were set ablaze by Viking axes, spared no ink to depict them as beast-like beings. And we believed them. We believed it because it fit the narrative. A savage people coming from cold, inhospitable lands couldn't care about things like hygiene. Their strength lay in their primal nature, their brutality and their simplicity. In films and books they are portrayed this way, mighty yet sloppy. Their camps are mere heaps of mud, their lives chaotic. This myth has thrived because it created a convenient contrast between the civilized Christian world and the wild pagan North. But what if I told you the truth was the complete opposite? What if Vikings were among the cleanest people of their time, and their obsession with hygiene shocked and even offended other cultures? Archaeological finds from Viking settlements across Europe tell an amazing story. In every Viking grave, whether of a man or a woman, combs are found. Not just any combs, but intricately carved from bone or horn, often adorned with complex patterns. This wasn't a luxury item. It was a necessity that everyone carried with them. Beyond combs, they found tweezers, ear scoops, and even nail care kits. These weren't just tools, they represented a culture of self-care. Sagas, the epic poems from Scandinavia, are filled with mentions of the importance of cleanliness. Heroes washed themselves, brushed their hair before going into battle, and changed their clothes. In one of the poems, the High One sayings, the god Odin himself offers advice. A man should go to the assembly clean and well-groomed. This means that one couldn't show up to an important gathering looking scruffy. But the most striking proof comes from those who despised them, the English. A 12th century English chronicler, John Wallingford, wrote with evident annoyance that the Danish Vikings settling in England were unbearably popular with local women. The reason? Their disgusting habit of bathing every Saturday, regularly changing clothes, and grooming their hair. Imagine the shock of an Anglo-Saxon for whom taking a bath was a rare event that happened only a couple of times a year. The Vikings introduced the concept of Saturday bath. The word laugardagur, which means Saturday, still refers to bath day in modern Scandinavian languages. They used soap made from animal fats and ashes, and happily enjoyed steaming in bathhouses resembling modern saunas. Their long hair and beards were not signs of untidiness, but sources of pride, carefully maintained. Some even lightened their hair using a special alkaline paste to achieve the fashionable light shade of the time. So, where did the myth of the dirty Vikings come from? It was born out of propaganda. For a monk witnessing the collapse of his world, it was unthinkable to accept that these pagans could be better in any way. It was easier to declare them dirty animals to justify their inhumane brutality in his own eyes and those of his congregation. The truth is that a Viking stepping onto the shores of England likely smelled of soap and freshness, with neatly braided hair and beards. This cleanliness, this concern for appearance, was as much a weapon as their sharp axes. It inspired both fear and a strange, inscrutable respect. From this deceptive cleanliness, which turned out to be the false calling card of an entire people, we now shift to the purity of stone in the Andes, where the myth of primitive builders hides an engineering genius that could rival modernity. Myth number 3. The knot string. Writing is just accounting. Incas. Now, take your mind above the clouds, to where the air is thin and cold, and mountain peaks pierce the sky. Here, in the empire of the Incas, Tawantinsuyu, sprawling for thousands of kilometers along the Andes, was a civilization that didn't know the wheel or our familiar written language. And it's this last fact that gave rise to one of the most enduring and derogatory myths, that the Incas were brilliant administrators but primitive in terms of information storage. Their famous quipu, bundles of colorful cords with knots, had long been considered nothing more than accounting books or mnemonic devices, like a knot to jog your memory. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered quipu in the 16th century, they were puzzled. They saw specially trained individuals, known as quipuca mayok, reading these naughty bundles and extracting precise data on taxes, population, harvests, and troop movements. The Spaniards acknowledged their effectiveness as a counting tool, but denied them the right to be called a writing system. For a European raised on the alphabet, writing consists of symbols that represent sounds. What could a bunch of knots possibly communicate? This gave rise to the myth of the illiterate empire. Historians and anthropologists upheld this view for centuries. Quipus were seen simply as numbers, a complex yet still basic arithmetic. This allowed the Incas to fit neatly into a convenient narrative. Great builders, fantastic organizers, but lacking a true culture, without literature, and without a history recorded in their own words. Their past seemed mute, only narrated by conquerors. This idea was convenient because it placed European culture with its phonetic writing on a higher pedestal, portraying it as the only possible path for civilization's progress. But what if those knots didn't just count, but told stories? What if it wasn't just arithmetic, but genuine literature woven from threads? Modern research, led by scholars like Gary Urton, is beginning to crack this ancient code, and what they're discovering is shaking the foundations of our understanding of the Incas. It turns out that a quipu is not just knots on a rope. It's a complex, three-dimensional binary system for encoding information. Each element of a quipu held meaning: the color of the thread, how it was twisted, clockwise or counterclockwise, the type of knot, simple, figure eight, long, its position on the cord, and the direction of any auxiliary threads. The combination of these elements created a density of information comparable to cuneiform or hieroglyphics. Researchers found that quipus encode at least 24 different thread colors and 2 main twisting directions. This gives 48 unique combinations for just one cord, even before a single knot is tied. Mathematical analysis shows that the system could hold over 1,500 individual pieces of information. That's more than enough to create a full-fledged writing system. The most exciting discovery is that quipus were likely of 2 types. Most were indeed statistical, recording data for the vast bureaucratic machine of the empire. But some, so-called narrative quipus, seem to have contained not just numbers, but stories, myths, genealogies, laws, and perhaps even poetry. The Spanish chronicler Ciesa de Leon mentioned that Quipucamayo could read the history of each Sapa Inca through the knots. This isn't just memory, it's reading. We're on the verge of a groundbreaking revelation. Decoding quipus is akin to deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs with the Rosetta Stone. While we can't read them fluently just yet, it's already clear that the myth of the illiterate empire is a product of colonial arrogance. The Incas were not illiterate. They had their own way of being knowledgeable, creating a unique writing system that was not flat, but three-dimensional, not drawn, but woven. Their story doesn't stay silent. It speaks in a language we've almost forgotten how to understand, a language of knots, colors, and textures. This wasn't primitive bookkeeping. It was a complex language made from alpaca wool, waiting for its moment to reveal the grandeur of the Sun Empire. From this coded language, waiting for its Champollion, we'll return to China, where another myth, tied to the greatest maritime fleet of its time, hides a tale not of discoveries, but of showcasing unbreakable power. Myth number 4. The peaceful treasure fleet seeking only friendship, ancient China. In the early 15th century, long before Columbus and Vasco da Gama, fleets unlike anything the world had seen were setting sail from the ports of Nanjing. This was the treasure fleet of the Ming dynasty, led by the legendary admiral Zheng He, who was also a eunuch. Hundreds of ships, including massive baochuan, treasure ships that reached up to 120 meters in length, embarked on 7 epic voyages across the Indian Ocean, reaching the shores of Africa and Arabia. The story of these voyages is usually presented like a beautiful fairy tale. We're taught that these were missions of peace and friendship. Unlike the European colonizers who would come later with fire and sword, the Chinese brought silk, porcelain, and culture. Their goal was not conquest, but establishing diplomatic ties, expanding trade, and showcasing the magnificence of the Middle Empire. Zheng He is portrayed as a wise diplomat, and his fleet as a floating exhibition of Chinese civilization's achievements. This myth is incredibly popular, especially in modern China, as it paints a picture of a historically peaceful power that used soft power centuries before the term was even coined. We believe in this because it's a lovely story that contrasts the enlightened East with the greedy and aggressive West. It suggests that expansion can also be peaceful. But beneath the shine of porcelain and the rustle of silk lies the clatter of steel and the roar of cannons. The reality was much more pragmatic and brutal. Zheng He's fleet wasn't just a trading mission, it was the most powerful naval force on the planet, built with one main purpose: to project power. Emperor Yongle, who had usurped the throne, desperately needed to legitimize his authority. One way to do this was to make the entire known world recognize his Middle Empire as the center of the universe and pay tribute to it. The treasure fleet was his tool. Each Baochuan was accompanied by dozens of military ships, carrying thousands of elite soldiers armed with crossbows, flamethrowers, and the world's first naval cannons. The total number of people in these expeditions reached 27,000. That's more than the population of many European capitals at that time. And this force was used without hesitation. During its first voyage, Zheng He encountered the pirate fleet of Chen Zuyi off the coast of Sumatra. Instead of negotiations, the admiral launched a naval battle, completely destroying the pirate fleet. Chen Zuyi himself was captured and later executed in Nanjing. This wasn't a police operation. It was a public lesson for anyone daring enough to challenge Chinese dominance at sea. In Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, the local ruler Alagankara was hostile towards the Chinese. Zheng He didn't bother with diplomacy to resolve the conflict. His troops stormed the capital, captured the ruler and his family, and took them back to China as trophies. In their place, a loyal puppet monarch was installed. This was pure military intervention. Even the famous giraffe, brought to the emperor's court from Africa and presented as a qilin, a mythical creature symbolizing prosperity, wasn't a result of a peaceful exchange. It was part of the tribute that the ruler of Bengal was forced to pay after Zheng He's fleet convinced him to recognize the Ming's supremacy. The goal of the expeditions wasn't just trade, but to make local kingdoms and sultanates enter the Chinese tributary system. The arrival of a giant armada at your shores was an offer you couldn't refuse. You either sent envoys with tribute to Nanjing, or you risked sharing the fate of the Ceylon ruler. The myth of a peaceful fleet took shape later when Confucian officials, who were hostile to the costly maritime ventures of the eunuchs, destroyed most of the expedition logs. In the remaining official chronicles, the focus was shifted to diplomacy and trade to protect the dynasty's reputation. The truth is that Zheng He's fleet was a tool of imperial hegemony, just as effective as the Spanish galleons, albeit operating under a more elegant disguise. This was a steel hand in a silk glove. From this hidden power roaming the oceans, we will turn to another kind of strength, one hidden in the hands of women in the harsh world of Scandinavian warriors, where reality turned out to be far more emancipated than we tend to think. Myth number 5. Submissive housewives waiting by the hearth. Vikings. The image of women in the Viking Age in popular culture is almost always the same. She is either a beautiful Valkyrie from the myths or, more often, a compliant wife and mother whose life is confined within the walls of a longhouse. Her duties include raising children, weaving cloth, cooking meals, and anxiously gazing at the horizon, waiting for her husband's return from yet another raid. She is the backdrop against which men's exploits unfold, a passive keeper of the home, completely dependent on the will of her husband, father, or brother. This myth took root thanks to Victorian historians of the 19th century, who projected their own views of a patriarchal society onto the past. For them, it was unimaginable that in a barbaric society, women could hold any power or independence. Sagas, although they featured strong and willful heroines like Gudrun or Freydis, were seen as literary exaggerations rather than reflections of reality. We bought into this image because it was simple and easy to understand. It created a clear division of roles, the man as the warrior and provider, and the woman as the mother and caretaker. This view of the world was convenient and didn't require questioning the established beliefs about history. It made the Viking world predictable and hierarchical. But ancient Scandinavian laws and archaeological findings tell a completely different story. one about women who had rights and freedoms that were unthinkable for their counterparts in Christian Europe. The truth is, women in Viking society held an astonishingly high status. The foundation of their power was keys. The mistress of the household wore a set of keys on her belt, opening all the chests and storages. This wasn't just a symbol, it was real power. She controlled all the resources of the household, from food and clothing to silver brought back from raids. A man could acquire wealth, but it was the woman who managed it. This made her not a servant, but a full-fledged partner and manager of the family business. Scandinavian laws, documented in collections like The Grey Goose, back this up. Women had the right to own property. They could inherit land and possessions from their parents, and kept their dowry rights even in marriage. What's more, they had the right to divorce. If a husband was lazy, couldn't provide for the family, or, worst of all, was abusive, she could publicly announce her divorce in front of witnesses and take not only her dowry, but also a share of the joint property with her. This gave her an economic independence that women in medieval England or France could only dream of. Their roles weren't limited to the home either. Women were merchants, farmers, and some were even scald poets. They could accompany their husbands in colonial expeditions, as seen in Iceland and Greenland, becoming the true mistresses of new lands. But the most astonishing revelation, which completely shatters the myth, was made in 2017. Genetic analysis of remains from a famous 10th century warrior burial site in the Swedish town of Birka, which had always been considered the grave of a high-ranking military leader, revealed that the skeleton belonged to a woman. She was buried with the full arsenal of an elite warrior: a sword, an axe, a spear, arrows, and 2 horses. Next to her was a set of gaming pieces, indicating that she was not just a fighter, but a strategist planning battles. This discovery overturned the notion that women warriors and shield maidens existed only in myths. They were real. The myth of the submissive housewife was crafted by those who viewed the past through the lens of their own limitations. The reality was a world where women could be the masters of their fate, own property, dissolve marriages, and even lead warriors into battle. Their strength was not in passive waiting, but in actively managing the world they claimed as their own. From this unexpected strength found in Scandinavian women, we'll journey to the Andes to bust the myth of the Great Road System, which was really not about connecting places, but about total control. Myth number 6. Roads for everyone, connecting the empire. Incas. The Great Inca Road, Capac Ñan, is one of the most impressive engineering feats of pre-Columbian America. This network, stretching over 40,000 kilometers, cut through deserts, jungles, and towering mountain passes, linking the farthest corners of the massive empire of Tawantinsuyu. In our minds, it's tightly associated with the Roman roads, a symbol of unity, trade, and prosperity. We picture bustling pathways where caravans of llamas carry goods, farmers bring their produce to markets, and travelers freely move from one end of the empire to the other. This paints a picture of wise and caring rulers who created infrastructure for the good of their people, connecting fragmented tribes and creating a common economic space. The myth of roads for everyone is super appealing. It portrays the Incas as enlightened builders and their empire as a harmonious and integrated state where everyone could reap the benefits of civilization. We buy into this because it aligns with our modern understanding of infrastructure. Roads are built for people, to make travel and trade easier. It seems natural and logical. But the truth, as is often the case in despotic empires, was much harsher and more controlling. Inca roads were not public. They were strictly state-owned, and common folks were forbidden from stepping on them without special permission. They served not as the veins of the empire, but as its nervous system, entirely under the control of the central authority in Cusco. Only those in government service could use the Capac Ñan. First and foremost, this meant the army. The roads allowed the Incas to rapidly move troops anywhere in their extensive empire to suppress the constant uprisings. The wide, paved stretches, staircases carved into the rocks, and impressive hanging bridges over canyons were designed for quick troop movements. Along these roads, every few kilometers were tambos, inns and storage houses where the army could restock supplies and take a break. The second group of users were the chasquis, imperial messengers. This relay system allowed messages and orders to be delivered from Cusco at speeds up to 240 kilometers a day. A chasqui would run their segment from one tambo to the next, passing on a verbal message or quipu to the next runner. This ensured the Sapa Inca almost instant, by the standards of the time, communication with his governors. Finally, roads were also used by officials, inspectors, and caravans carrying state goods, taxes collected in the form of products or resources needed for government needs. And that's it. For the average peasant, the road was a forbidden zone. Their world was limited to their community, the Ailu. Trying to use the imperial road without permission could lead to death. This system had two main goals. First, total control. By restricting travel, the authorities prevented unauthorized interactions between conquered peoples who might plot and rise up together. People were isolated in their valleys, and the only link to the outside world was an imperial official. Second, it served as a show of power. The road that passed by the village, yet remained off-limits to its residents, was a constant reminder of who was in charge. It symbolized the omnipotence and omnipresence of the state, which sees and controls everything. The myth of roads uniting people crumbles upon closer inspection. The Kipak Nyan didn't unite the population, but rather the imperial administration. It wasn't a tool for prosperity, but a tool for control. A whip, keeping hundreds of conquered tribes in line. These roads were veins, not carrying the life-giving blood of trade, but strict orders and punitive expeditions. From this symbol of total control, chiseled in stone, we return to China, where the myth of the great invention that changed the world hides the story of its slow and almost accidental birth. Myth number 7. Gunpowder, born for war. Ancient China. Ask anyone what gunpowder was invented for, and the answer will likely be clear-cut: for war. In our minds, the history of gunpowder is tightly linked to the roar of cannons, the smoke of muskets, and the thunderous explosions that forever changed the face of battle. We picture a brilliant Chinese alchemist searching for a weapon that could give his emperor an undeniable advantage, mixing saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur to create fire medicine, huoyao. This story fits perfectly into the narrative of technological breakthroughs driven by military needs. It glorifies the invention, turning it into an epic tale from the very beginning. The myth of gunpowder's martial purpose is appealing because it's simple and dramatic. It turns a serendipitous discovery into a targeted quest for the ultimate weapon. We believe in it because the entire subsequent history of gunpowder is a story of its military application, and we tend to project the outcome onto the original intent. It seems logical that such a powerful substance could only have been created with destruction in mind. But the real story of gunpowder's birth is far more ironic and quirky. It wasn't discovered in the pursuit of weaponry. It was found in the search for the exact opposite: eternal life. Ancient Chinese alchemists, especially during the Tang dynasty, 7th to 9th century AD, were obsessed with the idea of creating an elixir of immortality. They believed that by mixing various minerals and substances and applying heat, they could produce a magical potion granting eternal youth. In their writings, they described hundreds of experiments. And so, in one of the texts dated around the middle of the 9th century, a warning appears. An alchemist describes a formula that includes saltpeter and sulfur, cautioning other seekers of immortality. Do not mix these substances, for they will ignite, singe your beards, and burn down the house in which you are working. This was the first documented mention of gunpowder. It was born not as a weapon, but as a failed byproduct in the search for a remedy. Instead of the elixir of life, alchemists accidentally created a substance that brought quick and fiery death. Initially, this discovery didn't cause a sensation. The fiery and explosive mixture found its first use not on battlefields, but in entertainment. It was used by magicians and fireworks makers to entertain the imperial court. The bright flashes and loud bangs seemed like magic, capable of warding off evil spirits. It wasn't until nearly a century later, during the Song dynasty, that military engineers began to notice the potential of this fire medicine. But even then, its use wasn't what we imagine today. The first gunpowder weapons weren't cannons, they were fire spears, bamboo tubes packed with gunpowder that were fastened to the tips of spears. When ignited, they would spew out flames for several meters, working more like primitive flamethrowers to scare enemy infantry and horses. Later, small stones and bits of metal were added to the mixture, creating the first shrapnel. It would take hundreds of years more before the first true cannons and guns were developed, capable of launching projectiles with great force. Thus, the evolution of gunpowder went from an accidental discovery in an alchemist's lab, through entertaining fireworks and primitive flamethrowers, to full-fledged firearms. It wasn't born for war. War gradually adapted it for its needs, and this process took centuries. The myth of an instantaneous military breakthrough hides the truth of a slow, almost careless journey of humanity's greatest invention. It reminds us that the most significant discoveries in human history often happen not through deliberate seeking, but through sheer chance, in pursuit of entirely different, sometimes absurd goals, such as eternal life. From this accidental fire that changed the world, we now shift to the cold waters of the North Atlantic, where the myth of the Great Discovery hides a story of quiet and inglorious oblivion. Myth number 8. The Great Discovery of America that shocked the world. Vikings. Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, lands on the shores of a new land he calls Vinland, Wineland, around the year 1000. He and his crew become the first Europeans to set foot on American soil, almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus. This story is one of the central plots of Scandinavian sagas and a point of pride for the descendants of Vikings. In our minds, this event is seen as a monumental discovery that was supposed to change Europeans' understanding of the world. Imagine the news of a new, prosperous land spreading across Scandinavia and Europe, sparking a wave of interest that foreshadows the upcoming age of great discoveries. The myth of the Great Discovery paints the Vikings not just as raiders, but as explorers and pioneers who ventured beyond the known world. This gives their story a heroic and visionary twist. We buy into this idea, especially since, from our modern perspective, discovering a new continent is a huge deal. It seems unimaginable that such knowledge could go unnoticed or be ignored. We often project the significance of Columbus's voyage onto Ericsson's journey. But the truth is, for the Vikings and the rest of Europe, the discovery of Vinland was not a monumental event. It was essentially a minor episode that barely registered in the minds of those living at the time and was quickly forgotten. So, why did this happen? First, for the Scandinavians, it wasn't so much about discovering a new world, but more of just another step westward. They had already colonized Iceland and then Greenland. The land further west seemed like just another island or a stretch of coast in their Atlantic holdings. They didn't realize they had stumbled upon a massive continent. To them, it was simply Vinland, a place with wild grapes and good pastures, but too far away and inhabited by hostile Skraelings, as they called the native population. Second, the Vikings were unable to establish a lasting presence there. Archaeological digs at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland confirmed a Scandinavian settlement, but it lasted only a few decades. The small group of settlers faced constant conflicts with local tribes who outnumbered them and knew the territory better. Unlike the Spanish, the Vikings had no firearms, no horses, and no deadly diseases to give them a critical edge. Eventually, maintaining a connection with a distant and unwelcoming colony across thousands of miles of turbulent ocean just wasn't worth it. They left. Most importantly, this news didn't make any waves in Europe. Information about Vinland was contained within Icelandic sagas, written down 200 to 300 years after the actual events, and mainly circulated within Scandinavia. For the rest of the Christian world, Iceland and Greenland were at the edge of the known world, and tales of lands even further west were seen as local folklore. The only mention of Vinland outside Scandinavia before Columbus comes from a German chronicler named Adam of Bremen, who wrote around the year 1075. He briefly notes that a Danish king told him about an island called Vinland, but he didn't attach much importance to it. There was no fanfare, no expeditions, and no impact on geographical maps. The world simply didn't take notice. The myth of a great discovery emerged much later in the 19th century, when Scandinavian immigrants in America sought to establish their contribution to the history of the New World. They resurrected the story of Leif Erikson, turning him into a national hero and the first discoverer. The truth is that the Vikings' discovery of America did not change anything. It was knowledge that was born and died on the fringes of civilization, leaving no ripples in the waters of history. True discovery isn't just about finding something. It's also about understanding what you found and being able to share that knowledge with the world. The Vikings didn't manage to do that. From this forgotten discovery, let's shift to the heart of the Inca Empire, where the myth of the divine ruler concealed a complex system of political compromises and ritual authority. Myth number 9. The all-powerful god-emperor whose word was law, the Incas. Sapa Inca, the only Inca. In our minds, he appears as an absolute monarch, a living deity, the son of the sun god Inti. His power is limitless, his word is law, beyond discussion. We picture him in a golden litter, carried on the shoulders of hundreds of servants, dressed in garments made from the finest vicuña wool, which he wears only once. Anyone who dares to look him in the eye risks their life. His empire, running like clockwork, obeys his every whim. This image of an all-powerful despot, whose will shapes the destinies of millions, was largely crafted by Spanish chroniclers. Used to the European model of absolute monarchy, they depicted the Sapa Inca in familiar terms, exaggerating his personal power to enhance the significance of their victory over him. Capturing and executing a simple lord is one thing. Overthrowing a living god is quite another. Actually, it was the priests and heads of the relevant clans who spoke through the mummies. So, the political scene of Cusco was filled not only with the living, but also with dead players whose influence was huge. Before making a big decision, like starting a war, building a road, or introducing a new tax, the ruling Sapa Inca had to gain the support of the most influential clans. He couldn't just issue a decree. He had to negotiate, form alliances, win over certain clans, and weaken others. His authority was constantly threatened by conspiracies and intrigues from half-brothers, uncles, and cousins from other clans, each of whom might have their own claim to the throne. Moreover, the emperor's power was significantly limited by traditions and rituals. His life was scheduled down to the minute. He had to perform countless ceremonies, fasts, and sacrifices to ensure good harvests, victories in battle, and the favor of the gods. He was more of a servant of the cosmic order than the master of his fate. Any failure, a drought, a defeat in battle, an earthquake, could be interpreted as a sign that he had lost divine favor, which would instantly weaken his position and strengthen his rivals. The civil war between brothers Huáscar and Atahualpa, which broke out just before the arrival of the Spanish, was not just a dynastic squabble. It was the culmination of a centuries-old system where the death of the emperor always led to a fierce power struggle between competing clans. Atahualpa won, but at the cost of division and weakening the empire, which Pizarro took advantage of. The myth of the all-powerful Sapa Inca is an oversimplification. In reality, he was the tip of a complex aristocratic oligarchy, a figure whose divinity was both a source of immense power and a heavy burden, forcing him to constantly navigate the interests of powerful clans, both alive and dead. From this tangled web of power in the Andes, let's head back to China to the story of the eunuchs, who were far from the powerless servants we imagine them to be. Myth number 10. Powerless servants whose only role is to serve, ancient China. The image of the eunuch at the Chinese imperial court conjures up a picture of submission and humiliation. We imagine a man stripped of his masculinity, with a high voice, solely focused on serving the emperor and his harem. His role seems purely functional. He is a safe guardian of the women's quarters, a trusted servant who can't establish his own dynasty, and is therefore, theoretically, supposed to be utterly devoted to his master. In popular culture, they're often portrayed either as pathetic sycophantic schemers or as loyal yet completely powerless shadows in the corridors of the Forbidden City. This myth arose from Confucian ideology, which prioritized family and the continuation of the lineage. For the Confucian scholar officials, who wrote the official history, the eunuch was an incomplete person, a half-man, whose existence contradicted the natural order of things. They purposefully downplayed their role in their chronicles, portraying them as the source of all troubles and corruption at court. We believed in this image because it made sense physiologically. Someone unable to have children seems to lack the main male ambition, to create a legacy. Their power seems borrowed, derived from the emperor, not their own. But behind these official records, written by their fiercest enemies, lies the story of how powerless servants repeatedly became the most powerful political force in China, holding the fates of emperors and the entire empire in their hands. The truth is that eunuchs were far from powerless. Their unique position gave them incredible advantages. Unlike scholar officials who came and went, eunuchs spent their entire lives in the inner chambers of the palace. They had been with the emperor since his childhood, serving as his caregivers, teachers, and playmates. This created a deep personal bond based on trust, which no minister could boast of. The emperor trusted eunuchs more than his officials, whom he suspected of self-interest and loyalty to their own clans. Gradually, eunuchs began to take on more and more responsibilities. They controlled access to the emperor, deciding who could meet him and which reports and petitions would reach him. This gave them immense power. They could elevate their allies and undermine their enemies simply by manipulating the flow of information. During the Ming Dynasty, eunuchs reached the height of their power. Emperor Yongle established a special secret police known as the Eastern Garden, led by his most trusted eunuch. This organization was responsible for spying on officials, monitoring their actions, and even carrying out arrests and executions without trial. Eunuchs became the eyes and ears of the emperor, his sword of retribution. They controlled the treasury, managed state workshops, and even Admiral Zheng He, who commanded the massive treasure fleet, was a eunuch. Some eunuchs grew so powerful that they effectively ruled on behalf of weak or young emperors. Wei Zhongxian, at the end of the Ming Dynasty, created a whole clique of eunuchs that controlled all appointments in the government. Officials had to pay him huge bribes to secure their positions, and those who dared to oppose him faced torture and death. For a time, he was the most powerful person in China, an uncrowned emperor. The myth of the powerless servant is propaganda created by their political opponents. In reality, eunuchs were the third force in Chinese politics, alongside the imperial family and the bureaucracy. Their story is not one of humiliation, but rather of an incredible social rise, where people from the lowest backgrounds, sacrificing their ability to have families, could reach heights of power unattainable to the most noble aristocrats. They were not shadows, but kingmakers whose intrigues and ambitions shaped the course of Chinese history for centuries. From those palace intrigues hidden behind silk screens, let's return to the harsh world of the Vikings to debunk one of the bloodiest and most dramatic myths, which likely never was a reality. Myth number 11. The harsh northern blue bloods, Vikings. We often picture the Scandinavians of the Viking Age as a single, unified people. In our minds, we see tall, blue-eyed blonde individuals, true Aryans of the North, whose blood was as pure as the snows of their homeland. The idea that Vikings made up a closed ethnic group has fed various nationalist myths for centuries. In books and films, they appear as identical twins, sharing the same facial features and light hair, fiercely protecting their culture from outside influence. This image paints a picture of an isolated society of proud individuals who scorn outsiders and trust only their own. We believed in this myth because it created a beautiful story of a pristine culture, untouched by the mixing of tribes, crashing into Europe like an icy storm. But modern science ruthlessly tears off this mask, revealing a stunningly diverse picture. The greatest secret of the Vikings is that Viking isn't even a nationality. It was a profession, a way of life, and, if you will, an open corporation. Massive genetic studies in recent years, analyzing hundreds of remains from all over Europe, have created quite a stir. It turned out that the blood of these tough northerners flowed with the ancestry of half the world. In their settlements, geneticists have found traces of Southern European, Asian, and even indigenous lineage. In the famous Scandinavian burial sites lie individuals whose ancestors were born on the shores of the Caspian Sea or in the steppes of Central Asia. They didn't live in isolation. Their ships sailed rivers and seas, reaching Constantinople and Baghdad. They traded with Arabs, served in the Byzantine Guard, and absorbed everything they encountered. Vikings were pragmatists to the core. If an outsider was strong, clever, or useful, they were gladly welcomed on board. Archaeologists have found Kufit coins, Persian silk, Irish jewelry, and Frankish weapons in their capitals. Moreover, many of those whom Europe horror-struck called Vikings turned out to be genetically Picts from Scotland or Sami who adopted Scandinavian culture and joined the raids. Imagine their camp not as a gathering of identical blondes, but as a noisy, multilingual Babylon, where languages, clothing, and traditions blended together. This was an incredibly cosmopolitan society, whose strength lay not in mythical blood purity, but in a remarkable ability to adapt, learn from other peoples, and attract various individuals to their ranks. From this vibrant, diverse crowd of seafarers, blurring the boundaries of the world, we'll now move high into the mountains, where the myth of a perfect society without money hides a harsh machine of state coercion. Myth number 12. The perfect empire without money. The Incas. When 19th century historians began exploring the Inca Empire, they were stunned by one fact. In this vast nation, which built incredible cities and roads, there was no money. No gold coins, no silver bars, no paper bills. This fact quickly blossomed into a beautiful, romantic myth. Tawantinsuyu was dubbed a socialist paradise, a utopia where there was no greed, where everyone worked for the good of society, and a wise state distributed wealth fairly. No commercial trade, no opportunistic merchants, just pure, selfless exchange. This image of a perfect society excited the minds of European thinkers tired of the capitalist race. Even today, we sometimes sigh while reading about the Incas, envisioning a harmonious world free from the vices of a monetary system. However, behind the facade of this cashless utopia was a brutal system of total economic control. The Incas didn't actually need money because a person's body, time, and labor were the main currency of the empire. This system was called mita, a labor draft. Instead of paying taxes with gold, every able-bodied man had to work for the state for a certain number of months each year. Men were taken from their villages and sent to build roads, construct temples, terrace mountainsides, or serve in the army. The state did not distribute goods selflessly. It extracted all surplus production and stored it in giant warehouses. If a province faced a poor harvest, the authorities would open the stores, but this was not charity, it was strict calculation. The empire needed living, working taxpayers. Moreover, some form of currency did exist, but access to it was tightly controlled. The elite currency was the shells of the spondylus mollusk brought from the warm shores of modern Ecuador. They were valued even more than gold. For the Incas, gold was merely the sweat of the sun, a beautiful metal for rituals, while spondylus was considered the food of the gods and a symbol of fertility. The control over the extraction and distribution of these shells was in the hands of the emperor himself. So, the absence of familiar coins did not make society equal. On the contrary, it tied individuals to the land and the will of officials far more securely than any debt to a moneylender. People could not accumulate wealth. They could not change their fate through commerce. Their lives, from birth to last breath, were logged in a strict accounting ledger of the state. The myth of utopia crumbles, revealing the cold mechanics of a great empire where each citizen was just a cog in the grand, soulless machine of creation. From this harsh, heavily organized reality of the Andes, we will travel to the Celestial Empire to see how the myth of isolation concealed the brightest intersection of world cultures. Myth number 13. A closed empire turned away from the world. Ancient China. The phrase ancient China almost always conjures up an image of the Great Wall of China. And along with that comes a persistent myth. China was a closed, arrogant empire, walled off from the rest of the world, looking down on everything foreign. We think that for centuries, Chinese people lived in their own bubble, seeing foreigners as, at best, curious barbarians, and at worst, filthy savages. This myth is strong because it resonates with later periods in Chinese history, when the country really did try to shut its ports to European powers. We project that isolation onto the preceding millennia, imagining a mysterious, impenetrable land hidden behind fog and silk. But if we travel back to the Tang or Song dynasties, we'll see a picture that shatters this stereotype. Whether you found yourself in the capital of Chang'an in the 8th century or in the port city of Quanzhou in the 12th, your head would spin from the variety of faces, languages, and religions. China wasn't just turning its back on the world, it was its bustling commercial heart. In Chang'an, the largest city on the planet at that time, tens of thousands of foreigners lived. On its streets, you could meet Persian merchants, Indian monks, Arab diplomats, Japanese students, and Syrian priests. Buddhist temples, Islamic mosques, Zoroastrian altars, and Nestorian Christian churches all coexisted peacefully. Quanzhou, which Marco Polo called Zaitun, was even more astonishing. It was a true megacity of free trade. The city had entire neighborhoods exclusively populated by Arab and Persian merchants. They had their own schools, hospitals, and cemeteries. Today, thousands of gravestones from Quanzhou still survive, inscribed in Chinese, Arabic, and Persian. Foreigners didn't just come to trade, they integrated into society. Some Arab merchants became so wealthy and influential that they were appointed to high government positions, managing entire maritime provinces in the name of the Chinese emperor. The empire didn't fear outsiders, it harnessed their talents, connections, and resources for its own enrichment. Chinese ships sailed to India, the Persian Gulf, and the shores of East Africa, bringing back spices, incense, and precious stones. The myth of an isolated nation hides an incredibly vibrant, noisy, and open civilization that eagerly absorbed ideas from around the globe and generously shared its own. From this ancient globalism, we'll turn back to the Vikings to take a look at the ships that actually built their empire, and they were not the elegant vessels of legend. Myth number 14, swift dragons that brought glory, Vikings. Drakkar, dragon ship. Just saying that word feels like the clash of sword on shield. We envision a narrow, fast silhouette cutting through gray waves. At its prow, a carved wooden head of a beast snarls, and round shields hang along the sides. It's the perfect raid machine, fast, maneuverable, able to navigate deep into rivers and drop fierce warriors right at the walls of defenseless monasteries. These ships are what we picture when we think of the Viking Age. Their story feels like it revolves around these fierce vessels. We buy into this myth because it's cinematic. Drakkars are celebrated in sagas, they're discovered in royal burial mounds, and they've become a symbol of the aggressive expansion from the north. It seems that the might of Scandinavia rested entirely on the speed of these wooden dragons. But the truth is, Drakkars were just luxurious toys, like the special forces of the maritime world. They were narrow and cramped, had little room for cargo, and out in the open ocean, they were quite vulnerable to storms. If the Vikings had relied solely on Drakkars for their voyages, they would never have discovered Iceland, settled Greenland, or created their massive trade network stretching from Dublin to Kyiv. The real hero of their era, the workhorse that built their empire, was a different kind of ship, one that rarely gets the spotlight in movies. It was the Nar. Imagine the exact opposite of a sleek Drakkar. The Nar was stout and wide, with a deep draft. It didn't have a menacing figurehead on the bow. It was slow and not suited for surprise attacks. But it had one colossal advantage. It could carry an incredible amount of cargo. Its vast hold could fit tons of walrus ivory, seal fat, wine, wheat, timber, and even humans. It was on Nars that Scandinavians transported cows, horses, and sheep across the raging waters of the North Atlantic to establish new colonies on distant islands. The Nar was managed by a small crew of just 15 to 20 men, relying mostly on its massive square sail rather than oars. It was designed to withstand the fiercest ocean storms, rolling over waves like a cork. Without Drakkars, the Vikings would have been robbed of their glory as raiders, but without Nars, they would have simply starved in their remote settlements. This was the ship of traders, settlers, and explorers. The myth of Drakkars has obscured the true nature of Scandinavian expansion. They weren't just warriors seeking loot. They were brilliant logistics experts, capable of moving entire communities and tons of goods across thousands of miles over the roughest ocean on the planet. From these stout workhorse ships, we turn our gaze back to the peaks of the Andes, where lies a mystery that forces us to rethink what we've assumed were mere peasant farms. Myth number 15. Primitive farmers on stone terraces, the Incas. When we look at photos of the ruins of the Inca Empire, our eyes often glide over the endless rows of step terraces descending the mountainsides. School textbooks explain it simply. There's little flat land in the mountains, so the Incas had to carve out steps to grow their modest crops of potatoes and corn. This creates an image of hard, primitive agricultural labor, a desperate struggle against harsh nature for every handful of soil. We perceive these terraces as a makeshift solution, an architectural crutch for an underdeveloped form of farming. This myth paints the Incas as great stone workers, but rather ordinary farmers who merely scaled up basic gardening ideas to gigantic mountains. But if you go to a place called Marais, located in the sacred valley of the Incas, your understanding of their agriculture will be turned upside down forever. Marais is not like your typical flat terraces. These are massive, perfectly round amphitheaters that plunge deep into the ground. For a long time, their purpose was a mystery. Some thought they were ceremonial centers, while others believed they were venues for ritual games. But research by soil scientists and climatologists revealed the truth that sounds like science fiction. Marais was not a temple. It was a colossal, high-tech agricultural laboratory for genetic selection and plant acclimatization. The Incas didn't just throw seeds into the ground. They understood how microclimates worked. In the amphitheaters of Marais, each level of the terrace has its own temperature. Thanks to the unique shape, depth, wind direction, and sunlight exposure, the temperature difference between the upper and lower levels can reach 15 degrees. This means that within one funnel, the Incas recreated climatic conditions from dozens of different regions within their vast empire, from hot tropics to harsh mountain peaks. Scientists have discovered that the soil on different levels was brought in from various parts of the country. Here, Incan agronomists conducted complex experiments. They planted crop varieties brought from the Amazon rainforest at the lower, hotter levels, and then, generation after generation, they moved them higher and higher, forcing the plants to mutate and adapt to the cold and thin air. In doing so, they created new, super-resilient varieties of corn, quinoa, and potatoes, which then spread throughout the empire, saving millions from starvation. They were experts in hybridization and selection, with empirical knowledge that European science wouldn't catch up to for centuries. The myth of primitive farmers hides a remarkable truth. The Inca Empire was nourished by the work of brilliant bioengineers who turned mountains into open-air laboratories. From this power over nature in the Andes, we'll shift to the palaces of China, where science was also ahead of its time, debunking yet another long-standing misconception. Myth number 16. Backward science stuck in philosophy, ancient China. There's a persistent belief that ancient Chinese thought was deeply poetic, philosophical, but completely impractical. We admire their calligraphy, the writings of Confucius, and Taoist parables. But when it comes to the exact sciences and mechanics, our minds picture a stagnation. We think the Chinese were too immersed in contemplating the harmony of the universe to invent intricate machines or engage in precise calculations. The real technological revolution, the mechanics of gears and springs, is all seen as the exclusive domain of the European Renaissance. This myth is so popular because it reinforces the idea of Western superiority in engineering and the hard sciences, leaving the East with only spiritual practices and fine arts. But let's dig into the dusty archives of the Song dynasty, and we'll uncover the figure of a man named Su Song. In the 11th century, this remarkable scholar, astronomer, and engineer built a device in the capital of the empire that would change our understanding of the history of technology. It was a cosmic tower with a clock, standing 10 meters tall. These weren't just simple sand or water clocks. This was a masterpiece of mechanical art, an incredibly complex astronomical tool, and a water-driven clock that utilized technology which wouldn't appear in Europe for several more centuries. At the heart of Su Song's tower was the escapement mechanism, an essential element of any precise mechanical clock that allows for the controlled release of energy at regular intervals. Europe would only invent this mechanism in the 14th century. Inside the Chinese tower, giant bronze armillary spheres rotated, mimicking the movements of stars and planets. Every hour, and every quarter hour, wooden figures dressed in silk would emerge from special doors, striking bells, gongs, and drums to indicate the exact time. The mechanism consisted of hundreds of gears, shafts, and levers, crafted with incredible precision. The tower didn't just tell time, it symbolized the emperor's control over time, synchronizing the life of the empire with the rhythm of celestial bodies. The blueprints and descriptions of this device that have survived to this day amaze modern engineers with their complexity and mathematical accuracy. And this was not an isolated case. Chinese scholars created seismographs that could detect earthquakes hundreds of kilometers away, invented complex weaving looms, and mechanical compasses on chariots that always pointed south thanks to a sophisticated system of differential gears. The myth of a backward, purely contemplative science is an illusion that hides a civilization of engineers and mechanics whose gears turned centuries before the first mechanical clock towers were erected in Europe. From the steady ticking of these ancient mechanisms, we'll leap into the chaos of a battle of Scandinavian warriors to dispel one of the most cinematic yet misleading images. Myth number 17. Crazy warriors chewing on mushrooms. Vikings. Berserk. This word has long become synonymous with ferocity. The image of a half-naked, tattooed giant charging into the enemy ranks without armor, frothing at the mouth and with a crazed look in his eyes, shows no mercy and feels no wounds. The legend says that before battle, these elite warriors of Odin would fall into uncontrollable rage, consuming flyagaric mushrooms or other hallucinogenic fungi. Under the influence of this trance, they would gnaw on the edges of their shields, howl like wolves, and smash everything in their path, unable to tell friend from foe. We love this myth. It fits perfectly into the picture of the primal, untamed fury of the North. The idea of super soldiers drawing strength from psychoactive substances sparks the imagination and makes stories about Vikings even more exotic and chilling. However, if we take a look at serious historical and botanical research, the image of a shroom-fueled savage crumbles to dust. There isn't a single credible historical source from the Viking era that mentions warriors using mushrooms. The concept of the flyagaric mushrooms popped up only in the late 18th century when a Swedish priest trying to make sense of the strange behavior of berserkers described in sagas drew parallels with shamanic practices from some Siberian tribes. This hypothesis was picked up by Romantic writers and has since become entrenched in pop culture. Even more, modern medicine shows that the effects from flyagarics include nausea, loss of coordination, and drowsiness, absolutely the worst states for anyone heading into close combat. So, who were the berserkers really? The truth is much more pragmatic but no less fascinating. Berserkers weren't uncontrolled psychopaths. They were highly skilled professionals, the personal guard of kings and chieftains. Their battle trance wasn't the result of drug-induced intoxication, but a product of intense psychological training, self-hypnosis, and religious rituals comparable to modern special forces prep. They would enter altered states of consciousness through rhythmic breathing, chanting, and focusing on images of totemic animals, bears or wolves. Some scholars suggest the use of belladonna, a plant that dulls pain slightly but doesn't cause hallucinations. Interestingly, berserkers often served as judicial champions. In Scandinavian law, there was a custom called holmgang, judicial duels. If someone couldn't defend themselves, they would hire a berserker. It was a lucrative legal profession. But as the Viking Age came to a close and strong centralized states emerged, these independent bands of professional killers became a threat to the new powers. By the 11th century, their activities were officially outlawed, and they vanished from the pages of history. The myth of drugged savages strips berserkers of their true identity, the face of calculated, disciplined, elite warriors whose fury was their sharpest weapon. From the cold calculation of northern warriors, we return to the Andes to unravel the main mystery of a lost city that was never lost. Myth number 18, the lost city concealing a great secret, the Incas. Machu Picchu. Just the name conjures up images of cloud-covered ruins, hidden away in impenetrable jungles. When Hiram Bingham discovered the city in 1911, the world gasped. A legend quickly formed. This was the last stronghold of the Incas, a secret capital where sun priests and maidens fled after the arrival of the Spaniards to preserve their sacred knowledge and gold. Or perhaps it was a mystical monastery whose existence was kept a closely guarded secret for centuries, hidden from even the fiercest conquerors. This myth is incredibly captivating. It taps into our desire to believe in ancient mysteries, buried treasures, and sacred places hidden from the eyes of outsiders. We want to believe that the Incas managed to keep at least a part of their greatness away from the relentless machine of conquest. But when archaeologists and historians began to thoroughly examine the archives and the very stones of Machu Picchu, the myth of the secret citadel faded away, giving way to a much more straightforward yet intriguing reality. Machu Picchu was never a secret, and it certainly was not the last refuge of resistance. In fact, it was simply a luxurious getaway, a summer residence of one of the greatest Inca emperors, Pachacuti. Imagine an elite resort. Here, in the warm climate below Cusco, the emperor came with his family, entourage, and guests to unwind from the harsh realities of governance, hunt, and hold religious rituals. The city was not built to defend against the Spanish. It was constructed long before they arrived, during the empire's peak. It housed only about 750 people, most of whom were staff, cooks, weavers, and gardeners. The city's architecture, with its exquisite temples and fountains, was designed to showcase the owner's status and wealth. So why didn't the Spanish find it? The answer is simple. They weren't looking for it. Because by the time they arrived, the city had lost all significance. According to Inca tradition, when an emperor died, his estates did not pass on to the next ruler. They remained the property of his mummy and the clan that served it. The new emperor had to build his own residences. After Pachacuti's death, Machu Picchu simply ceased to be a political center. When the empire collapsed and the supply system vanished, the staff gradually left, returning to their native villages. The city wasn't destroyed, it just quietly fell asleep. Local farmers always knew about its existence and even continued to grow crops on its terraces long before Bingham arrived with his expedition. The myth of the lost mystical city is a projection of our own romantic fantasies. The reality paints a picture of an empire so rich and powerful that its rulers could afford to build architectural masterpieces in the clouds just to enjoy weekends in comfort. From this majestic everyday life, we shift to a different kind of architecture, to China, where the myth of fragility conceals a genius that has triumphed over earthquakes. Myth number 19. Wooden pagodas, fragile against the elements, ancient China. Take a look at European castles and cathedrals, solid stone, thick walls, a sense of eternity and permanence. Now imagine Chinese architecture, graceful wooden columns, curved roofs, paper partitions. In our minds, there's a myth that Chinese architecture was beautiful, but incredibly fragile. We think these airy structures would crumble at the slightest breeze or earthquake. Historians of the past often looked down on Chinese architecture, considering it less serious compared to the stone giants of Europe. We bought into this myth because wood can rot and catch fire, which makes it seem less reliable than granite. The idea of a fragile East and a sturdy West fit neatly into cultural stereotypes. But this myth reveals a great triumph of engineering if we look at how these wooden marvels performed during the most terrifying test, an earthquake. China is in one of the most seismically active regions on the planet. If their buildings were just fragile shacks, there would be no trace of ancient architecture left. The secret to their incredible resilience lies in a unique architectural element called dugong. Dugong is a complex system of wooden brackets that connects the columns to the roof. On the outside, it looks like a tangle of interlocked wooden blocks forming a decorative eave, but in reality, it's a brilliant shock absorber. The thing is, traditional Chinese architecture didn't use nails or rigid connections when assembling the framework. All the elements are joined together using a mortise and tenon joint, leaving a little gap. When an earthquake strikes, a rigid European stone building, tightly bound with cement, resists the shocks, develops cracks, and eventually collapses under its own weight. A Chinese building, on the other hand, starts to dance. The dugong system lets the structure's elements glide, rub against each other, and flex, absorbing the earthquake's kinetic energy. The heavy roof, which seems like a threat, actually acts as a stabilizer, pressing the structure down while the flexible framework sways. Modern engineers have conducted experiments by placing an exact replica of a traditional Chinese building on a shaking platform. The model withstood an incredible simulation of an earthquake, while concrete structures crumbled. Wooden pagodas that have stood for 1,000 years have survived countless destructive seismic events, just swaying in rhythm. The myth of fragility hides a profound understanding of the laws of physics. Chinese builders didn't try to conquer nature with the brute force of stone. They learned to yield to its power, creating buildings that bend but don't break. From this flexible strength, frozen in wood, we'll return to the Vikings to uncover the truth about symbols we often think are magical. Myth number 20. Runes as the language of mystical spells. Vikings. Runes. Angular, sharp symbols carved into gray stone. In modern pop culture, esotericism, and fantasy, they've become the ultimate symbol of magic. We see heroes drawing these signs in the air to summon lightning, or carving them onto charms to attract good luck. We've been led to believe that runes are a secret alphabet used by Scandinavian shamans, a language of the gods where each word carries a hidden mystical meaning. The very names of the runes sound like ancient spells. This myth is so successful because it wraps Viking history in a dense fog of mystery. We like to think that our ancestors had knowledge that went beyond everyday life, and that their writing was a tool for communicating with the beyond, rather than just a way to share information. But if we come down from the clouds of fantasy to the chilled ground of Scandinavian settlements and look at what ordinary people from the Viking Age left behind, the myth of a magical alphabet gives way to an incredibly vibrant and mundane reality. Runes weren't secret knowledge for the chosen few. They were an everyday practical alphabet used by everyone, from kings to merchants and simple farmers. The angular shapes of the runes were dictated not by mysticism but by practicality. They were easy to carve with a knife on wood or bone, avoiding horizontal lines that could splinter the wood fibers. In the Norwegian city of Bergen, archaeologists uncovered an incredible archive, hundreds of wooden tablets and sticks covered in runes, and what was written on them is worlds apart from magic. They contained love notes, cheeky jokes, business contracts, IOUs, and even tags for goods. Just imagine the ancient equivalent of text messages. On one stick, a wife writes to her husband, "Gita says to come home." On another, an unlucky suitor carved, "I love another man's wife." The third one is a tag that says, "This yarn belongs to Thorgrim." On the walls of ancient temples and tombs, where Vikings traveled during their expeditions, even up to the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, they carved the mundane, "Halfdan was here." Of course, runes were used in rituals and on gravestones, just as we use Latin or elegant fonts for special occasions today. But their main purpose was pragmatic. The myth of magical runes turns Vikings into fairy tale characters, while the truth makes them real people with everyday worries, humor, and business savvy. They carved runes not to cast spells, but to live, trade, and communicate with one another. From these carved wooden love messages, we'll now travel to the Inca Empire to examine the myth of brutal justice, which turned out to be much more practical than we thought. Myth number 21. Bloodthirsty laws that punish even the slightest offense with death. Incas. When you read the early Spanish chronicles describing the laws of the Inca Empire, your blood runs cold. Chroniclers paint a picture of a state where even the slightest deviation from the rules was met with incredible brutality. It was believed that Inca laws came down to 3 main commandments: do not steal, do not lie, do not be lazy. We were led to believe that breaking any of these rules meant certain punishment. A person could be thrown off a cliff, stoned, or hanged by their hair. This myth painted a picture of a fearful, tyrannical society where order was maintained solely through terror. We believed it because it explained how the Incas managed to uphold discipline in such a vast empire without prisons as we understand them in Europe. It seemed logical that only the fear of inevitable punishment could compel millions to obey the will of Cusco without question. But if we take a closer look at Inca legal practices through the lens of modern anthropological research, we see a system that was far from senseless cruelty. Inca justice was surprisingly flexible, pragmatic, and focused on restitution and rehabilitation rather than blind vengeance. The state couldn't afford to waste human resources by executing every peasant who stumbled. As we know, human labor was the main currency of the empire, and killing a taxpayer for a petty theft would be the epitome of economic inefficiency. The reality was that the severity of punishment depended not so much on the crime itself, but on the status of the offender and the circumstances of the case. The system was strictly hierarchical. If a common person stole food because their family was starving, it was often the local official who overlooked the issue and failed to provide for the community from state stores who faced punishment, not the thief. This was an unprecedented level of social responsibility from those in power. However, if a noble or an official, whose needs were fully met, committed theft, then the punishment was indeed harsh, potentially leading to a loss of status and hard labor. Most minor offenses, like squabbles or laziness, were punished with public shaming, flogging, or an increase in work quotas. The aim of justice was not to destroy a person, but to reintegrate them, to make them compensate the community and the state. While brutal public executions did occur, they were mostly reserved for treason, rebellion against the emperor, or desecration of sacred sites. The myth of bloodthirsty justice was convenient for the conquistadors to justify their own brutality and portray the Incas as savages in need of civilized European law. The truth is that the Inca Empire was governed by a complex, nuanced legal system that prioritized economic practicality and social stability over blind terror. From this pragmatic justice of the Andes, we now turn our gaze to the Middle Kingdom, where the myth of unchanging traditions masks a remarkable history of constant change and adaptation. Myth number 22. A stagnant culture repeating itself for millennia. Ancient China. When we look at Chinese art, architecture, and fashion throughout the centuries, an untrained eye might perceive an illusion of stagnation. It may appear that from the Han Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty, for over 2,000 years people wore similar clothes, wrote with the same characters, built pagodas with curved roofs, and worshipped the same ancestral spirits. The myth of unchanging China paints this great civilization as a fly trapped in amber, beautiful, perfect, but devoid of evolution. Thinkers of the past love to contrast the dynamic, ever-searching West with the conservative, frozen East, which supposedly peaked in ancient times and has only been copying itself ever since. We tend to believe this because the visual code of Chinese culture is very strong and looks quite uniform to the European eye. However, behind this illusion of unchangeability lies a bubbling cauldron of cultural revolutions, radical shifts in paradigms, and constant social transformations. Chinese culture has been incredibly adaptable. What we see today as innately Chinese is often the result of adaptation and rethinking of foreign influences. Take Buddhism, for example. It isn't a native religion of China. It came from India. But the Chinese didn't just adopt it. They transformed it beyond recognition, merging it with Taoism and Confucianism, creating Chan Buddhism, which later became Japanese Zen. Even everyday life and fashion were constantly evolving. The famous chairs and stools that are essential in a classic Chinese interior were unknown to the ancient Chinese. Before the Tang Dynasty, they, like the Japanese, sat exclusively on mats on the floor. Seating furniture was borrowed from nomadic tribes and became a symbol of luxury and a new lifestyle. The well-known queues worn by Chinese men and the snug qipaos are a legacy of the Manchus, who took power in the 17th century and forced their customs on the Chinese population. What seems like a monolithic tradition is actually a layered pie of borrowings, philosophical upheavals, and technological leaps. Intellectual life in China has seen periods of strict censorship and times of incredible freedom of speech when scholars openly criticized emperors. The myth of a frozen culture is a mistake in focus. From a distance, an ocean seems still, but when you get closer, you see the constant movement of currents, storms, and tides that have reshaped the shores of this great empire throughout its history. From these invisible cultural storms of the East, we'll transition to the cold waters of the North to debunk the myth of how Vikings treated those we now consider the most vulnerable members of society. Myth number 23. Ruthless selection, weeding out the weak. Vikings. A harsh northern landscape, piercing winds, and a community whose survival relies on the strength of each of its members. In our minds, Viking society resembled ancient Sparta. We're convinced that in a world where only physical strength and warrior valor were valued, there was no place for the weak, sick, or disabled. The myth suggests that babies with birth defects were mercilessly left in the woods to be devoured by wolves, while the elderly, who could no longer wield a sword or work in the fields, were condemned to die of hunger or forced into ritual suicide. This picture paints a portrait of cold-hearted pragmatists, soulless rationalists willing to sacrifice humanity for the survival of their tribe. We readily buy into this image because it highlights the extreme conditions in which the Scandinavians lived and makes them feel even more different from us, the modern people endowed with compassion. But if we listen closely to the silence of ancient burial sites, archaeology tells us a completely different, poignant, and touching story. The bones that have lain in the earth for centuries speak of profound mercy and an incredible level of medical and social care in Viking society. In Icelandic and Swedish burial grounds, researchers repeatedly find remains of individuals who endured severe injuries or suffered from serious congenital conditions, yet lived long lives. For instance, in one grave, a skeleton was discovered of a man with a severe form of dwarfism and joint deformities. He couldn't walk on his own. His life depended entirely on others. According to myth, he should have been disposed of in infancy. But the reality is that he lived into old age and was buried with great honors in a rich grave, indicating his high social status. Perhaps he was a respected craftsman, a skald, or an advisor. Moreover, on many warrior bones, you can see signs of terrible wounds, broken thigh bones, fractured skulls, that were Botham. This myth is convenient because it highlights the land-based engineering genius of the Incas, creating an image of a great civilization, yet isolated in its continental grandeur. But as soon as European chroniclers first approached the shores of South America, this myth shattered against the hulls of gigantic ocean ships. The Incas were not landlocked recluses. Their empire included coastal peoples, particularly the rulers of the Chincha Valley, who, under the patronage of the Sapa Inca, established one of the most impressive trading fleets of the pre-Columbian era. These were not just tiny boats, but massive ocean rafts made from balsa wood trunks, an incredibly light and buoyant material. These vessels, equipped with masts and cotton sails, could carry tons of cargo and crews of 20 or more people. What was most astonishing was how they were maneuvered. Without the steering oars we're used to, the sailors of the empire used a brilliant system called guara, a system of retractable wooden keels that were lowered between the logs of the raft. By raising and lowering these boards at the front and back, they could steer, change course, and, most impressively, sail against the wind, making complex tacks. European navigators didn't master this technique until much later. The balsa fleets set off on bold, months-long expeditions far to the north, reaching the shores of modern Central America and Mexico. They carried bronze axes, textiles, and gold to trade for sacred spiny shells. There are even well-supported hypotheses, backed by local legends and the discovery of sweet potatoes in Polynesia, suggesting that some expeditions could have ventured deep into the Pacific Ocean. The myth of mountain recluses hides from us the image of fearless ocean traders whose sails caught the winds long before Spanish galleons appeared on the horizon. From the vastness of the Pacific, we return to the secluded chambers of Chinese palaces, where the story unfolds not of brutal coercion, but of incredible female resistance. Myth number 25. Foot binding as a curse imposed by men. Ancient China. Tiny lotus shoes. At first glance, they strike modern viewers with horror. Foot binding, the artificial deformity of young girls' feet in traditional China, is one of the most discussed and condemned practices in history. In our minds, a completely monolithic myth is formed. It was an ancient, sadistic practice devised by powerful patriarchs in ancient times to cripple women, make them submissive, limit their freedom of movement, and confine them permanently to inner quarters. We see this as the epitome of male oppression, a cruel law that was blindly and ruthlessly imposed on all women of the empire for thousands of years. However, if we turn to the cold historical facts, this emotional myth begins to break apart into complex, contradictory fragments. First of all, this tradition is by no means ancient in the context of Chinese history. It all began in the 10th century during the Southern Tang dynasty, and at first it had nothing to do with oppression. It was an extravagant trend started by palace dancers who tightly wrapped their feet with silk ribbons to dance on their toes inside a giant golden lotus, dazzling the emperor with their grace. Think of it as the early version of modern point shoes. Only centuries later did this aesthetic, symbolizing extreme refinement and aristocracy, begin to seep into society. Secondly, foot binding was never universal. A large portion of the population, peasant women, especially in southern China, and the Hakka ethnic group, never bound their feet. They needed to work in the fields, standing knee-deep in water on rice paddies. Lotus feet were a marker of social status, a sign that a family was wealthy enough to afford a woman who didn't have to do physical labor. But the most shocking truth lies in who supported this tradition. When the Manchu Qing dynasty came to power in the 17th century, whose women never bound their feet, the emperors, those powerful men, issued strict edicts banning the practice under the threat of harsh punishments. And who fought back the hardest? The women themselves. For Chinese mothers, binding their daughters' feet was the only reliable ticket into higher society. A perfectly shaped foot could secure a girl from a poor family a marriage to a wealthy official. This was a woman's world, a subcultural code hidden from male eyes, passed down from mother to daughter. Women sabotaged the emperor's bans, hiding their daughters, enduring pain for what they considered beauty and a promise of a successful future. The myth of simple male sadism hides a far more complex and tragic story of how fashion, status, and female ambition intertwined into a cultural knot that not even the laws of a great empire could break. From these silk ribbons, woven with pain and ambition, we'll head to a Viking feast to snatch away the most famous yet completely fictional chalice from their hands. Myth number 26. Creepy chalices made from the skulls of vanquished enemies. Vikings. In the smoky hall of a longhouse, the roar of drunken voices fills the air, and the firelight illuminates rugged faces. There stands the chieftain, celebrating a great victory, holding high a gruesome trophy, a polished human skull brimming with frothy ale. He drinks from the skull of his fiercest enemy. This is one of the most iconic images associated with Vikings. But if you ask any archaeologist to show you even one of these cups found in Scandinavia, they will just smile. In over 200 years of excavations, not a single human skull has been found that was fashioned into a drinking vessel. So, where did this dark legend come from? The answer lies not in the brutality of the Vikings, but in a simple translation error made many centuries after the last longship rotted away in the ground. In the 17th century, Danish antiquarian and linguist Ola Worm translated an ancient skaldic poem called The Song of Kraki, where the legendary hero Ragnar Lodbrok, dying in a pit of snakes, looks forward to drinking mead in Valhalla. The original text in Old Norse used a complex poetic metaphor known as a kenning. It stated that heroes would drink from the twisted branches of skulls. Any Viking would have understood this play on words. Skull branches refers to animal horns, but Ola Worm, not fully grasping the nuances of skaldic poetry, translated the phrase into Latin literally as, from the skulls of those. Until the early 15th century, the Inca Empire was just one of many small, unremarkable tribes nestled in the Cusco Valley. Their influence barely reached beyond a few neighboring villages. Everything changed with the rise of an ambitious ruler named Pachacutec. He initiated a bold campaign of conquests. What we now call a great empire was built in the span of just 3 generations of rulers. Pachacutec himself, his son Tupac Inca Yupanqui, and his grandson Huayna Capac. From the start of their expansion to that fateful day when Francisco Pizarro and his soldiers landed on the coast, less than 100 years had passed. Can you believe it? Less than a century. In that short time, the Incas managed to build 40,000 kilometers of roads, construct Machu Picchu, subdue hundreds of independent states, and impose their language and religion upon them. It was an unprecedented, breathtaking blitzkrieg. Their architecture, which we now regard as ancient, was often still under construction when the empire fell. Machu Picchu was still shining with novelty, and many temples stood surrounded by scaffolding. The myth of the thousand-year empire hides a much more impressive truth. The Incas weren't slow builders of eternity. They were the fastest force in pre-Columbian American history, a dazzling flash of a supernova that burned out as quickly as it lit up. From this astonishing sprint through time in the Andes, let's take a leap to China, to follow a road that never actually existed. Myth number 28. A continuous Silk Road connecting worlds, ancient China. The Great Silk Road. Just saying the name is like poetry. It conjures up images of a wide, beaten path stretching through deserts and mountains where endless caravans of camels march along. We picture brave Chinese merchants stepping out from the ancient gates of Xi'an, loaded with bales of precious silk, ready to personally display their goods in the bustling markets of Rome or Constantinople after years of perilous travel. This myth paints a picture of an ancient transcontinental highway, consciously built for global commerce. We believe it was a clear, organized artery connecting east and west into a single economic network, with silk flowing like a river. But if you had asked a merchant from the Han or Tang dynasty how to get to the Great Silk Road, he would have looked at you in confusion. That name didn't even exist. This romantic term was coined only in the late 19th century by the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen. The reality was infinitely distant from the image of a seamless highway. It was not a road at all, but a chaotic, pulsating web of narrow, dangerous paths that constantly changed direction based on wars, droughts, and political alliances. There was no continuous transit. Almost no sane person would attempt to journey from one end to the other. Instead, it was a system of blind relays. A Chinese merchant would only transport goods to the edge of the desert, where he sold them to Sogdian traders. The Sogdians would carry them over the mountains and sell them to the Persians. The Persians would then resell the goods to the Syrians, who took them to the Mediterranean Sea. The ownership of these goods changed hands countless times, and their price skyrocketed in a geometric progression. Surprisingly, silk wasn't even the main driver of this process. For centuries, glass from Rome, horses from the steppes, and spices from India traveled these roads. The Chinese valued the heavenly horses of Fergana much more than the chance to sell their silk. But the most important and significant commodity moving along these invisible threads wasn't things at all, but ideas. Paper, gunpowder, Buddhist scriptures, Islamic preachers, art, and even devastating epidemics were passed from oasis to oasis. The myth of a single Silk Road simplifies this complex mechanism of human interaction. The real route wasn't just a line on a map, but a chain of thousands of nameless intermediaries, each knowing only their small section of the Great Desert, unaware that they were part of the bloodstream of the entire Eurasian continent. From these dusty, nameless paths of the East, we'll return to the Vikings to look at the people themselves and debunk the myth of their fearsome appearance. Myth number 29. Ice giants towering over Europe. Vikings. If we gather all the descriptions of the Vikings left by terrified European monks and Arab travelers, we end up with an image of a race of true giants. Chroniclers describe them as colossi, as tall as palm trees, with shoulders broader than doorways, whose steps shook the ground. In modern cinema, this image is reinforced with relentless persistence. Actors portraying the Norse are always towering over their opponents, flexing their muscles. The myth of Vikings as genetically unique giants fits perfectly into the bigger legend of their invincibility. It seems logical that their crushing victories were due not only to their ferocity, but also to their overwhelming physical superiority. We willingly believe that the icy climate forged a race of superhumans. But let's set aside the fear-filled metaphors of medieval scribes and turn to the cold language of osteology. Measurements of thousands of skeletons excavated from ancient Scandinavian burial sites tell a completely different, disheartening truth. The Vikings were not giants at all. Due to a poor diet, lack of vitamins during the winter months, and hard physical labor from a young age, their height was quite modest by today's standards. The average height of a man during the Viking era was about 170 centimeters. Modern men in many parts of the world today are significantly taller than those who once instilled terror across Europe. Women, on average, barely reached 160 centimeters. Of course, there were tall individuals, but they were the exception, not the rule. So why did they appear as giants to Europeans? The answer lies in the psychology of fear and the specifics of their tactics. When a horde of armed individuals suddenly lands on your peaceful shore, shouting and striking swords against shields without mercy, they might appear to you as demons from the depths, towering towards the sky. Their perceived height is an illusion born from panic. Furthermore, studies of skulls have revealed another surprising detail. The faces of men and women from the Viking Age were much more similar to each other than they are today. Men had softer, more androgynous facial features and less pronounced brow ridges, while women often had strong jaws. The myth of giants takes away our understanding of their true achievements. Vikings didn't win because they were born as giants. They triumphed due to iron discipline, unmatched navigation skills, and refined tactics. They were ordinary people who managed to become a nightmare for an entire continent solely through their will and bravery. From these tough yet very real people of the north, we'll journey to our final destination, the Incan capital of Cusco, to see how the shine of gold dazzled not just the conquistadors, but the entire course of world history. Myth number 30, the gold rush and the empire of yellow metal, the Incas. Incan gold, two words that have become synonymous with unimaginable wealth. The entire history of the conquest of South America is woven with the feverish gleam of yellow metal. Legends of El Dorado, the famed room of redemption that Atahualpa promised to fill with gold to the ceiling in exchange for his life. Fabric was a passport. Through the patterns on clothing, you could tell a person's status and their homeland. Fabric served as currency, a political tool, and a high form of art. When the Incas saw the Spaniards melting down magnificent jewelry into shapeless ingots, ignoring the warehouses overflowing with precious kumbi, they viewed the conquerors not just as barbarians, but as madmen who didn't understand the true value of things. The myth of a golden empire was crafted by the winners, obsessed with metal. In reality, the greatest civilization of South America was an empire woven from threads, where true wealth was soft to the touch and provided warmth on chilly mountain nights. We're closing these heavy, dusty tomes. 30 myths, 30 great illusions that have clouded our vision for centuries, have melted away like morning fog over cold fjords, rice terraces, and mountain peaks. We've seen that Vikings weren't just bloodthirsty giants, but skilled healers, pragmatic traders, and people who knew the value of purity and law. We learned that ancient China wasn't a fortress frozen in arrogance, but a vibrant place bursting with life, colors, incredible inventions, and quiet yet unyielding female resistance. And we realized that the Incas weren't just creators of golden trinkets and stone walls, but brilliant engineer agronomists whose knots on ropes and woolen fabrics hid complex codes for managing a great state. The history you thought you knew was just a convenient tale written by those who came later, those who didn't understand, or those who benefited from hiding the truth. But now you know. You've looked beyond the facade of polished textbooks. I, the keeper of forgotten archives, pass this knowledge on to you. And remember, every time you're offered a simple, straightforward, and one-sided historical truth, somewhere in the shadows of libraries lies a document ready to turn your world upside down. Seek the shadows. For it's there, away from the floodlights of popular legends, that the true, unbearably beautiful and complex truth of humanity resides. The light fades, but your journey is just beginning.